A great Argead saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. Makalanaki. A new episode every single day. Episode 30. Persia, Golden Scales. The satrapal capital of Sardis, Ionia, late May, 368 BCE. To the fractured city-states of Greece, the world was a chaotic, blood-slicked arena of shifting alliances and bleeding borders, where the baseline of human existence was a desperate struggle for autonomous breath. But to the east, across the wine-dark expanse of the Aegean Sea, the world was a single, calculated geometry of absolute submission. For over 2 centuries, the Achaemenid Persian Empire stood as the undisputed architect of global order, a geopolitical colossus that did not merely govern territory, but define the very architecture of reality. Founded by the lightning, earth-shattering conquests of Cyrus the Great in the mid-6th century BCE, and perfected under the unyielding administrative genius of Darius I, the empire was a monumental machine that spanned 3 continents. From the scorching, mineral-rich sands of Egypt to the snow-capped, wind-sheared peaks of the Hindu Kush, its dominion was mapped not by shifting tribal agreements or fragile treaties, but by 20 vast administrative zones called satrapies. Each satrapy operated as a miniature kingdom, ruled by a royal governor, a satrap, who wielded the power of life and death over millions, yet answered exclusively to the terrifying, distant whisper of the great king in Susa. When the independent Greeks had attempted to defy this machine during the legendary Greco-Persian Wars a century prior, the imperial court discovered a profound structural reality. Its vast, multi-ethnic conscript armies, designed for the wide expanses of Asia, could not easily project raw physical force across the rugged, choked topography and fractured maritime landscape of the Greek mainland. Upon the bedrocks of Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, the imperial ambition sustained a devastating undoing before the unyielding bronze shields and desperate solidarity of the hoplite phalanx. Realizing the stark absurdity of attempting to subjugate the western frontier through the raw collision of bodies, the architects of Persian strategy executed a brilliant, cold-blooded paradigm shift. They traded the bronze spear for the gold coin. For 100 years, Persian statecraft weaponized the internal fragility and bottomless vanity of Greece. Through a clinical matrix of bribery and subsidies, the treasury of Susa systematically funded whichever city-state was weak enough to need their aid, ensuring that the Greeks would perpetually devour themselves in fratricidal wars. Without shedding a solitary drop of Persian blood, they continuously wrung an inexhaustible deluge of wealth. The gold Daric coins, stamped with the image of the great king drawing his bow, into the systemic fractures of Hellas, compelling the Greeks to mutually tear at one another's throats. This absolute dominion of gold achieved its ultimate structural completion with the termination of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE. To break the naval empire of their mortal rival, Athens, Persia channeled an astronomical sum of subsidies into the treasury of Sparta, constructing a lethal fleet of triremes that thoroughly plummeted Athens into ruin. Yet, the instant the victorious Spartans exposed their own ambitions toward the east, the great king immediately financed the reconstruction of Athens' walls, destabilizing the newly consolidated Spartan hegemony during the Corinthian War. In 387 BCE, exploiting the absolute exhaustion of the combatants, Persia forced the signature of the king's peace, the Peace of Antalcidas, a legal masterpiece dictated directly from the Persian throne. It was a humiliating decree that cleanly ceded ownership of the wealthy Ionian coast back to the great king and legally forbade any solitary Greek city from ever forming leagues or grasping total hegemony again. To Persia, a safe Hellas was exclusively a thoroughly fractured Hellas, eternally locked in functional insolvency by its own inherited vendettas. The moment one city rose above the baseline, Persia aggressively paid its rivals, deliberately tilting the scales. Driven by this invisible hand, the Greek city-states were perpetually forced to dance their choreography of blood upon the palm of the great king. By the year 368 BCE, as the aging great king Artaxerxes II Memnon enters his twilight years, this global hegemony is locked in a magnificent, dangerous paradox. In the Greek south, the balance of power has violently shattered. Thebes, led by the innovative military laboratories of Epaminondas, has crushed the legendary military myth of Sparta at Leuctra, plunging the mainland into a desperate, resource-poor vacuum. Yet, even as desperate Greek embassies flocked to Susa to beg for Persian gold to legitimize their domestic rules, the internal pillars of the Persian Empire have begun to fracture. Across Asia Minor, ambitious satraps, sensing the physical decay of the central court, are withholding their taxes, hiring thousands of Greek mercenaries, and igniting the great satraps' revolt. It is a world locked in a brilliant, exhausted stalemate. The empire maintains its global dominance solely because Greece remains divided into 1,000 bleeding pieces. And from the cold northern frontier of Macedonia, a 14-year-old prince named Philip is beginning to calculate the terrifying arithmetic of this reality. If a single mastermind can forge an iron engine capable of unifying the independent Greek states under one absolute banner, the decaying, rebel-torn colossus of Asia will lie completely exposed to a final, catastrophic strike. Late May, the thick, oppressive heat of late spring hung completely motionless over a mirror-smooth coastline, existing as a warped, heavy canopy of gold that made even the waves of the great Aegean appear sluggish and thick as oil. Far above the marble-floored satrapal residence of Sardis, the ancient western capital of the empire, a merciless sun beat relentlessly upon the dry dust of Anatolia. Yet, within the deep, shaded colonnades of Satrap Artabazus, the architecture maintained an engineered, absolute chill. Here, beneath soaring stone pillars designed to mimic the grand halls of Persepolis, the dense musk of crushed jasmine and the sharp, clean scent of brine, carried from the nearby sea, drifted with a ghostly stillness. Looming across the water as an obsidian shadow, looking down upon the antagonistic, bickering cities of the Greek West and radiating a persistent terror through its sheer, overwhelming mass, stood the boundless empire, silent, watchful, and waiting for its next transaction. From the gilded grand halls of Susa, the empire's distant heart, King Artaxerxes too did not view the bickering city-states of Hellas as equals in any capacity. To the great king, they were merely interchangeable pawns covered in dust, crawling unpredictably across a continental chessboard. His policy toward Greece was anchored in an ancient precept that consistently bared its fangs with ruthless efficiency, divide and rule. A fractured Hellas, where states systematically tore at one another's throats, was the safest, most cherished Hellas for the Persian Empire. Satrap Artabazus sat reclined upon a heavy couch inlaid with ebony, his luxurious silk robes rustling faintly as he thoroughly scrutinized a scroll of Egyptian papyrus. At that time, the interior of the Persian Empire itself was by no means a flawless bedrock. The vast stirrings of the great satrap's revolt and Egypt's persistent, infuriating obsession with independence across the fertile soil of the Nile were continuously eroding the imperial fringes. Yet, even amidst this domestic bloodshed, the cold gaze of the great king never shifted for a single micro-negative second from that nest of venomous insects known as the Greek peninsula. In fact, it was precisely because of these internal insurrections that any absurd scenario where the Greeks might unite and invade the East had to be aggressively neutralized before it could materialize. "Those Thebans," Artabazus murmured toward an aide holding a glass goblet of wine, his voice carrying a low, elegant friction. His tone mingled the irony of a refined intellectual with the clinical coldness unique to those who managed a hegemonic state. Lately, they seem entirely intoxicated by their own reflection in the mirror of their victory at Leuctra. Pelopidas marches through Thessaly as though he commands the wind itself, and Epaminondas treats the Peloponnese as his private garden. They are disrupting the scales, the equilibrium of Hellas, that my great king has spent centuries maintaining. And that equilibrium is the solitary, supreme treasure of our empire. Persian gold, the countless leather sacks gorged with Daric coins, was the ultimate weapon of influence, piercing the world far deeper than any bronze sword. It was a silent, dark river running soundlessly toward the treasuries of whichever city-state appeared most vulnerable, or whichever state could most effectively destabilize its neighbors. If Thebes showed any symptom of growing too powerful, Persian gold immediately flooded into the shipyards of Athens, resurrecting trireme fleets to threaten the Theban rear. Conversely, if Athens exposed an excessive naval ambition, attempting to reconstruct its ancient Aegean empire, halting Sparta would receive vast, well-timed subsidies, forcing the world to remember the martial muscle of the Lacedaemonian spear once more. "Let more gold run into the Peloponnese," Artabazus commanded, tracing a cold line with his fingertip across a highly detailed parchment map that included the critical coastal jewels of Ionia, Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna. Remind the Arcadians of the true nature of that deceptive generosity Athens boasts of. Let them maintain their internal blood feuds until they exhaust themselves to the point of forgetting one another's names, unable to wring out a solitary drop of blood. What the great king craves is not the triumph of a single Greek, but the eternal enmity of all Greeks. As Pelopidas departed for the volatile borders of Macedonia, answering the summons of the regent Ptolemy to intervene in the lineage of Perdiccas, the vast Greek world existed as an extraordinarily complex tapestry woven from grievance and intrigue. Thebes, the newly ascended Titan, starved to consolidate the absolute hegemony it had violently seized at Leuctra. Athens, the wounded phoenix, actively mapped every geostrategic fracture to fly once more from the ash. Sparta, the crippled lion, thrashed within a mire of blood merely to preserve its own existence. And Persia, the master in the shadows, coldly scrutinized it all from the darkness of Sardis, maintaining the readiness required to tip the scales at any given micro-negative second. Upon this vast chessboard, every solitary move was accompanied by monumental consequences, capable of fracturing the destiny of nations. Stepping into the political quicksand of Pella, Pelopidas was about to execute a move across the Macedonian border that would resonate far to the south. Neither the architects of this court in Sardis nor the great king in Susa had the slightest inkling that this solitary move, the abduction of the 14-year-old Prince Philip to Thebes, would nurture the very monster destined to dismantle the Persian Empire from its absolute foundations. Battle of the Achaemenid Day 2. The night the walls fell. The heavy stone seal of the sanctum ground open, and the two princes stumbled back into the chamber, their breathing ragged and shallow. The air in the room was stale, but to them it felt like a holy reprieve from the suffocating necrotic dampness of the marshes. They were a ruin. Mud, black and foul-smelling, as ancient grave dirt, clung to their tunics. Water dripped from their hair, leaving dark oily puddles on the stone floor. As the heavy slab closed behind them, the sudden grinding noise made the others jump. Philena was the first to react, rushing forward, her face turning ashen. "Gods, you look like you've been dragged from the river Styx." Argead and Menelaus recoiled instinctively, their noses wrinkling at the sharp putrid stench of swamp gas and decay that clung to their cousins like a shroud. Eurynos stood slowly, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirts, her eyes searching Philip's face for the harrowing truth of what they had found in the deep. "We've been living in agony here," Menelaus hissed, his voice hushed and frantic. The guards came for the midday meal and again, just before dusk. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to pretend two people are asleep in the dark? I had to bundle up rags in your bedding, it smelled like a dead dog, and the guard nearly opened the curtains to check on you. We nearly shattered." "We had to hold our breath," Philena added, her eyes darting to the heavy, iron-bound door. "They're suspicious. They don't believe the fever excuse anymore." Philip wiped a streak of black silt from his brow, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying intensity that silenced the room. He didn't offer apologies for the danger he'd placed them in. He simply gripped the edge of the stone bench, his knuckles white. "The fever excuse is finished," Philip said, his voice a low, raspy rasp that held the weight of a command. "We've found the exit. There's a channel that leads to the marshes, and tethered to a rotted pier, we found boats. We have a way out of this tomb." A wave of relief rippled through the group, but it was quickly replaced by an edge of sharp, jagged panic. Archelaus stepped into the torchlight, his clothes clinging to his shivering frame. "But we're a wreck. We look like we've been swimming through a sewer, which, effectively, we have. If we try to move in this state, we'll be caught before we even reach the corridor." Philip nodded, his mind already spinning the next move. "We need to look like princes again. We can't have the guards questioning why we smell of the marsh and death. We need dry tunics, and we need them now." He turned his gaze toward Euryno, his eyes softening only a fraction. "Send word to the guards. Tell them the chill has worsened, that we need fresh linens and warm clothing. Use the authority of our rank. They're superstitious men. They won't want to touch a sickbed if they can help it. And," he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the silence like a blade, "bring Mother. Bring her to the sanctum. Tell her it's time to stop waiting for the walls to hold and start preparing for the dark. If we are to walk out of this palace alive, we need her to know the path." Archelaus leaned against the wall, exhausted, but his eyes were fixed on Philip. And when the sun rises? When the sun rises, Philip said, looking toward the ceiling as if he could see the sky above, we won't be here. We'll be on the water, and by the gods, we'll be ghosts. The heavy iron bolt of the sanctum door rattled violently, a sharp metallic staccato that echoed through the dank corridor. Outside, the rhythmic tread of the guard faltered, then stopped. Who goes there? A voice barked, the sound muffled by the thick ancient timber. It was the shift commander, a man whose loyalty to the usurper was matched only by his dull-witted fear of the royal family. Urno pressed her back against the door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed her hair, composed her features into a mask of cold, imperious disdain, and slammed her palm against the wood one last time. Who? She shrieked, her voice dripping with enough manufactured venom to choke a courtier. You dare ask who? You insolent, pig-headed oaf. It is the wife of the regent, you common dog. There was a frantic scramble of boots on stone. The guard, clearly unnerved by the sudden vitriol, fumbled with the latch. When the door opened a crack, he peered in, his eyes wide and uncertain. Urno didn't give him a second to breathe. She stepped into the sliver of light, her chin lifted so high it looked painful, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, calculated arrogance. My husband's nephews are rotting with a fever, and you keep them in this tomb, she snapped, gesturing vaguely at the darkness behind her. They are shivering, the damp is reaching their bones, and you have done nothing but stand there like a wooden statue. The clothes they wear are soaked with sweat and filth. They are princes of Macedon, not street urchins to be left in the muck. The guard blanched, his hand instinctively flying to his helm. My lady, the orders were. The orders were to guard them, not to let them die of a chill. Urno interrupted, her voice rising to a shrill, commanding peak. If you do not fetch fresh linens, dry tunics, and warm furs immediately, I shall see to it that your head is adorning a pike before the sun touches the horizon. And bring the Queen Mother. She's the only one who knows how to treat this fever, and if you deny a mother access to her suffering kin, you will find out exactly how much a life in Pella is worth when the true masters return. She glared at him, a predator backed into a corner but acting like the queen of the jungle. Her performance was perfect. It was the classic arrogant entitlement of a noblewoman who had never known a day of labor. The guard, terrified of her temper, was already backing away. At once, my lady. At once, the guard stammered, turning on his heel. He didn't even wait for a confirmation. He bolted toward the barracks, the sound of his armored boots echoing down the hall. Urno slammed the door shut and slid the bolt back into place. She leaned against the wood, her arrogance vanishing, replaced by a shuddering, breathless terror. He's gone, she whispered, turning to face Philip and Archelaus, who were still caked in the foul black mud of the abyss. He'll bring the linens. And if the gods are kind, he'll bring Mother. But we don't have long. We need to look like princes again before she sees what we've truly been doing in the dark. The command chamber was thick with the scent of pine smoke and the metallic biting odor of whetstones on steel. A map of the Pella periphery, rendered in charcoal on a slab of gray slate, sat at the center of the table. Parmenion stood at the head, his eyes tracing the jagged line of the Aegean. The War Council was a tapestry of scars and ambition, from the ancient, weary hands of old Attalus to the jittery, nervous energy of Ismenias. The smoke tells the story, Parmenion said, his voice a low, grinding gravel. Pausanias has set his own engines ablaze. He is stripping his defenses, burning his siege lines to ash. He's moving to pin Iphicrates to the surf. A desperate gamble, old Attalus grunted, leaning heavily on his staff, his knuckles white. He trades the city for a sandcastle. He knows he cannot hold the walls and the beach simultaneously. But he hasn't emptied the harbor, Antipater countered, pointing a callous finger at the port section of the map. He leaves a garrison at the docks. He's hedging, the coward. He expects Iphicrates to take the bait of the harbor, only to trap him in the narrow piers. The Athenian representative, Telesias, stepped forward, his fine linen tunic a jarring contrast to the sweat-stained leather of the Macedonians. You speak as if Iphicrates is a man who merely reacts, Telesias said, his voice ringing with a thin, sharp pride. Our general is the cleverest man in Greece, a supreme strategist. He's not stumbling toward Pella in the dark. He already knows Pausanias is waiting for him at the coast. He is arrogant, Parmenion thought, watching the Athenian's steady pulse at his throat. But in this, he might be right. Parmenion turned back to the map. We must stop thinking like the usurper and start thinking like a fox. Achaemenid stepped forward, his eyes bright with a sudden, savage clarity. He didn't look at the map, he looked at the men, his hands gripping the edge of the slate until his knuckles turned the color of bone. Since their security at the port end gates is stretched thin, we don't have to wait for the landing to begin, Achaemenid said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, rhythmic hum. We use the usurper's own paranoia against him. We launch a sudden, violent assault on the eastern gate, faint, loud, and bloody. We make it look like we are desperate to break out. Pausanias, fearing for his lifeline, will panic. He will strip every remaining man from the harbor to reinforce that gate. He has to. If he loses the gate, he loses the city's heart. He'll bite, Parmenion thought, watching Achaemenid's face. Pausanias has always been a man of reactive terrors. He doesn't hold ground, he reacts to threats. And while he drains the weaker sector to save the stronger one, Antipater realized, his eyes widening as the tactical picture clicked into place, we strike the now abandoned port with the remainder of our force. They will have no one left to hold the docks. It will be a hollow shell. Achaemenid nodded sharply, his expression hardening. Exactly. We take the empty port, then circle back along the Lydias Channel to hit the defenders at the eastern gate from the rear. When we hold both the port and the gates, and the Athenians finally arrive, we can pin Pausanias against his own greed. We corner his army against the surf, or simply slaughter them where they stand on the coast. Callias leaned in, his cool detachment finally cracking. You are suggesting we leave the city walls entirely undefended to gamble on the harbor? I am suggesting we win the war before the sun sets, Parmenion cut in, his voice a low, steady rumble. Pausanias thinks he's playing a game of numbers on the beach. He doesn't realize he's playing a game of shadows in his own backyard. The risks are astronomical, Parmenion reflected, but in this vacuum of power, the boldest move is often the safest. He felt the weight of his years, the burden of a kingdom on the brink of being hollowed out by a usurper. If we fail, we are dead men in a cold room. If we succeed, we are the architects of the New Age period. Young Attalus, Parmenion commanded, his voice a blade. Take the light infantry. Keep them in the reeds near the channel. Do not reveal yourself until the fighting at the eastern gate turns into a scream. Achaemenid, you lead the assault on the gate. Make it loud. Make them think the entire Macedonian army is behind you. I will give them a performance they'll never forget, General, Achaemenid said, his breath hitching in a sharp, ragged sound. Parmenion's hand closed around the hilt of his sword, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of the steel. See that you do. While Pausanias marches in circles, blind to the fact that his foundation is crumbling, we will be waiting. When Iphicrat strikes the coast, we won't just be soldiers, we will be the final verdict on the usurper's reign. The air in the marshlands was thick with the scent of stagnant water and impending slaughter. Parmenion's hand fell, a sharp, decisive motion that signaled the end of waiting. Let's move, he rasped, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the reeds. Young Attalus held his breath, his hand raised in a rigid, singular command. Behind him, his light infantry moved not like men, but like vapor weaving through the silt. They were ghosts emerging from the black, sucking mud of the marshes, their skins smeared with grease and charcoal to swallow the moonlight. They slipped into the deep, reedy shadows along the Lydias Channel, each movement calculated to avoid the slightest rustle of the parched stalks. The air here was thick with the rot of 1,000 years, a suffocating perfume that clawed at the back of his throat. He felt the weight of every breath, the thrumming of his own pulse loud enough to be a drumbeat in the stillness. Patience, he thought, his jaw locked tight enough to ache. If a single blade catches a glint of the moon, if a single footfall triggers a ripple, Pausanias' entire command will descend on us like wolves. He signaled a halt, his men freezing into statues amidst the reeds. They were a coiled spring, agonizingly tight, waiting for the trigger. He watched their faces, hard, set masks of discipline. They were men who had lost their homes, their brothers, and their pride to the usurper. There was no fear in their eyes anymore, only a cold, hollow space where rage used to live. He looked down at his own blade. He had coated it in dark, viscous oil, dulling the steel until it was nothing more than a matte black shadow in his grip. It was a tool for quiet work. Not yet, he mused, his eyes tracking a patrol of Pausanias' mercenaries, passing just yards away on the embankment. They were loud, arrogant, their laughter echoing against the water. They think they own the night. They think the marshes are empty. They have no idea they are walking through the belly of a beast. He nudged the man beside him, a veteran scout who moved with the fluid grace of a viper. The scout nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the first dissonant clang of steel against steel that would ignite the night. Attalus closed his eyes for a heartbeat, visualizing the chaos to come. The gate will scream. They will panic. And when they look toward the noise, we will rise from the mud and finish them. He was a predator in the dark, and he knew that in the marshes, the most lethal thing wasn't the steel, it was the silence that preceded the strike. Near the eastern gate, the night didn't just break, it shattered. Achaemenid crouched in the shadow of a collapsed granary, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the faces around him, gaunt, hollowed-out men, their eyes bright with the fever of a final, desperate act. He gripped the strap of his shield, his knuckles white. "They think we are broken," he whispered, his voice barely a rasp. "Show them what a broken man does when he has nothing left to lose." He lunged out of the darkness, a blur of motion. He didn't just lead an assault, he ignited a riot. With a primal, soul-tearing roar, he slammed his shield against the iron-reinforced timber of the gate. The sound, a deafening, hollow clang, ripped through the stillness like a funeral bell announcing the death of the usurper's order. "Pella! For the Argeads!" he bellowed. Behind him, the dark alleyways belched forth a nightmare of shadows. A ragtag coalition of city guards and civilian warriors spilled out, a tide of rusted iron and sharpened farm tools. These were men who had watched their homes burn, men who had stood over the graves of children dead from the famine Pausanias had wrought. Their roar wasn't a battle cry, it was the accumulated howl of a starving city. "Kill them! Kill them all!" A voice screamed from the pack, followed by a chorus of visceral, wordless fury. The sound bounced off the stone walls, magnifying, multiplying, until the air seemed to vibrate with the sheer scale of the hatred. To the defenders huddled on the ramparts, it sounded as if the entire city had turned against them. Achaemenid shoved a man aside, his sword flashing in the torchlight as he parried a spear thrust from a confused sentry. He felt a savage thrill as the guard's eyes widened, recognizing that the orderly siege had devolved into a chaotic, blind panic. "They're terrified," Achaemenid thought, his mind crystal clear amidst the bedlam. "They hear 10,000 ghosts behind me, and they aren't brave enough to check if it's true." "Keep the pressure," he shouted, shoving his shield into the face of a mercenary who tried to hold the gate. "Do not give them room to breathe. Let them think the city is burning." High above, the shouting grew frantic. He could hear the heavy thud of boots running along the battlements. Pausanias' men were scrambling, their officers screaming contradictory orders, their formation crumbling under the weight of the perceived uprising. Achaemenid locked eyes with one of the civilian fighters, a man whose hand was missing 2 fingers, clutching a heavy iron club. The man looked at him, shivering, and Achaemenid nodded once, a grim, jagged promise. "We are the fire," Achaemenid muttered to himself, stepping over a fallen guard. "Let them try to put us out." High above, on the wind-swept battlements of the eastern wall, the Macedonian watcher felt the stone beneath his fingers shudder. The sheer volume of the sound, a grinding, rhythmic thumping punctuated by the guttural, inhuman screams of a mob, sent a jolt of ice straight down his spine. He leaned over the jagged parapet, his eyes wide, straining to pierce the swirling dust and torchlight below. What he saw wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a deluge. A sea of dark, frantic shapes was swarming the base of the gate, their weapons flashing like teeth in the gloom. "There at the gate," he screamed, his voice cracking, spiraling up into a frantic, high-pitched pitch. He clawed at the arm of his commander, who was trying to peer through the chaos from a safer vantage point. "They're trying to break out. There are hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The whole city is surging." The commander, a man whose face was a map of cynical scars, blanched as the roar intensified. "Gods," he thought, his stomach turning over. "They shouldn't have the strength to stand, let alone riot. Where did they find the steel?" "Signal the harbor garrison," the commander bellowed, his voice losing its composure. "Tell them to strip the docks. Move everything to the gate. If the wall falls here, we're all dead men." Below, the effect was instantaneous. Pausanias's men, huddled in the relative quiet of the harbor watch, were startled out of their lethargy by the frantic, dissonant ringing of the alarm bells. They looked toward the eastern wall, where the glow of torches was dancing wildly, and the sound of the screaming mob reached them like a coming storm. "Reinforce the gate." The order echoed, passed down the line by panicked lieutenants. "Leave the docks." "Move, move, move." The harbor defenders didn't think, they reacted. Discipline dissolved into a frantic, clattering rush. Armor rattled, shields banged against greaves, and sandaled feet thundered across the wooden piers as they sprinted toward the sound of the war. They didn't see the shadow that moved along the marsh's edge, the cold, calculating eyes of the hidden scouts, watching them abandon the harbor to its fate. Yes, the commander thought, watching his men abandon their stations, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird in a cage. Go. Run to your deaths at the gate. Leave the back door wide open. In their haste, they left the port abandoned, the heavy iron chains of the dock slack and inviting, the silence of the harbor now heavy with the weight of impending betrayal. They ran toward the scream of the city, oblivious to the fact that they were running exactly where they were needed to be, anywhere but the gate they were about to lose. In the port, only a handful of weary sentries remained. They stood on the edge of the wooden piers, their hands trembling on their spear shafts, their eyes transfixed by the distant howling commotion at the eastern gate. The night air, usually filled with the brine of the Gulf, now tasted of smoke and imminent disaster. There, tearing the city apart, one sentry muttered, his voice barely audible over the distant screams. "Why aren't we going?" "We're just standing here while the others win the glory." "Keep your post," his sergeant growled, though his own grip on his sword was white-knuckled. "If the commander says stay, we stay." Perched in a hidden overlook high above the harbor, Parmenion watched the harbor's defenses wither. He saw the last of the heavy infantry retreat into the dark streets, their heavy footfalls fading as they sprinted toward the faint. They're biting, Parmenion thought, his heart a steady, iron pulse, rhythmic and cold. The fear of the gate is stripping the harbor of its teeth. Pausanias has abandoned his own heart to protect his skin. A signal whistle, a low, piercing note, sharp and hungry as a hunting hawk, shredded the air. It was a sound that cut through the cacophony of the riot like a blade. "Now!" Ismenias roared from the mouth of the alleyway. He didn't wait for a reply period. He split his force with the cold, surgical precision of a butcher. 2/3 of his men, a blur of polished bronze and shifting shadow, broke cover and sprinted toward the now unguarded docks. The final third remained with the civilian warriors, their shields locked into an impenetrable wall. They stood as the anchor, a stoic shield wall ensuring that if the city's defenders realized the deception and turned back, they would find only a wall of steel, not a slaughter of bait. The assault on the harbor was not a fight, it was an occupation. Old Attalus, Parmenion, and Ismenias converged on the docks, emerging from the gloom like avenging spirits. They moved with the grim, silent efficiency of men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the kill. The remaining sentries, paralyzed by the sudden appearance of the Macedonian vanguard, had only a second to realize their error. Their mouths opened to shout, but the sound never came. They were silenced before they could even draw their steel, their bodies efficiently consigned to the oily black water of the Gulf. There was no splash, only a gentle ripple that vanished into the darkness. Old Attalus stepped onto the main pier, his boots clicking on the wet wood. He stood for a moment, listening to the silence of the docks, then scanned the horizon, his ancient eyes searching the star-strewn void for the first sign of Athenian sails. "The port is ours," old Attalus breathed, the weight of the city's salvation resting heavy on his voice. "Now we hold the door open until the fleet arrives." Parmenion didn't pause to celebrate the capture of the docks. He didn't allow himself the luxury of a victory breath, even as the cold spray of the Gulf hit his face. To him, the harbor was merely the first piece in a grand, lethal puzzle. "Don't let them stabilize," he commanded, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "We move." Like a shadow passing through a house, they swept from the harbor toward the secondary gates. The guards stationed there were complacent, leaning against the cold stone, listening to the fading, distant roar of the riot at the eastern gate. They were expecting a slow, grinding siege that would last until dawn. They were not expecting the specters of the Macedonian vanguard. The attack was a symphony of precision. There was no herald, no challenge. only the sound of leather boots on stone, and the wet, stifled grunt of men dying in the dark. Blades found gaps in armor before the sentries even realized the port had fallen. It was a domino effect of professional violence. Each gate surrendered the next with terrifying, bloodless speed. Within minutes, the walls that once held the usurper's power had become his cage, the iron bolts now sliding into place from the inside. Parmenion stood atop the inner bastion, his heavy cloak flapping in the salt wind. Below him, the city lay quiet, save for the frantic screams still echoing from the eastern perimeter. He could see Pausanias's men huddled there, bathed in the sickly orange glow of their own torches, desperately piling barricades against a phantom enemy that had already bypassed them. "They are guarding a door that is already off its hinges," Parmenion mused, a cold, grim smile touching his lips. "They are fighting the air while we own the foundation." He watched them, his pulse steady and slow. By the time they realize the harbor is gone, the sea will already be full of Athenian ghosts, and the ground beneath their feet will belong to the crown once more. He turned back to the men waiting in the gloom of the secured gatehouse, men who held their lives in his hands. "Check the perimeter," Parmenion ordered, his voice echoing in the hollow silence. "Tighten the net. If a mouse tries to leave the city, I want it dead before it reaches the walls." He looked toward the horizon, where the dark line of the sky met the blacker expanse of the sea. "The trap is set. Now we wait for the wolf to come to the shore. And when Pausanias realizes he has nowhere left to run, we shall see how much steel remains in his soul." To be continued in episode 31, Athens Phoenix's Gaze. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.